Country music has roots that run deeper and wider than the industry has always been willing to admit. The banjo came from West Africa. The blues came from the Mississippi Delta. The guitar techniques that defined the sound of the Carter family, the first family of country music, were taught by a black man from North Carolina who never got a recording credit for any of it.
And the bells drop and the smoke clear.
These are 9 country music icons who walked into a segregated industry, faced barriers that most people today can barely imagine, and left the music permanently changed. Some of them paid a price for it that the industry only acknowledged decades too late. All of them deserve to have their stories told. Number 9. Lesley Riddle, the man who built the foundation, 1920s to 1930s.
The word is out.
Lesley Riddle lost his right leg at the knee in a cement plant accident when he was a teenager in Kingsport, Tennessee. During his recovery, he took up the guitar, learning blues and gospel from his uncle, developing a picking technique using his thumb and index finger because the middle and ring fingers of his right hand had been lost in a separate shooting accident years later. The disability forced him to invent something new. What he invented was a picking style, so distinctive that when Maybelle Carter adopted it as her own technique, the country music world called it Carter picking and credited the Carter family with its creation for the next several decades. Riddle met A.P. Carter in December 1928 and began accompanying him on song-collecting trips across the Appalachian Mountains, 15 journeys in total, into communities that would not have welcomed A.P. Carter alone. Riddle's role was specific and essential. A.P. would write down the lyrics of any song he wanted. Riddle would memorize the melody. He said later, "I was his tape recorder. He'd take me with him and he'd get someone to sing the whole song. Then I'd get it and learn it to Sarah and Maybelle." The songs they collected became the foundation of the Carter family's recorded catalog. Can the Circle Be Unbroken, Hello Stranger, the Cannonball Blues, and Lesley Riddle's name was on none of the recordings. He was featured in the very first episode of Ken Burns's landmark PBS documentary Country Music in 2019, finally receiving some measure of public recognition nearly 90 years after those song-collecting trips. A North Carolina highway historical marker was placed on Highway 19 near Burnsville to honor his contributions. An annual festival called Riddle Fest is held in his hometown. Lesley Riddle died in July 1979 in Asheville, North Carolina. He never made a living from music. The man whose guitar technique shaped the Carter family sound and whose song-collecting trips built their catalog spent his later years as a shoeshine boy and a school crossing guard, in the same city where the music he helped create was making other people famous. Number 8. Deford Bailey, the harmonica wizard, 1920s to 1940s. Here is a fact that almost nobody knows. The Grand Ole Opry got its name because of a black man. On a Saturday night in 1927, WSM radio host George D. Hay went on the air immediately after a broadcast of operatic music by conductor Walter Damrosch and said, "For the past hour, we have been listening to music largely from Grand Opera, but from now on, we will present the Grand Ole Opry." The performer who had just played, the one whose music prompted that announcement, was Deford Bailey. Without Bailey's harmonica performance that night, the most famous country music institution in American history might never have had its name. Bailey was a pioneer member of the WSM Grand Ole Opry and one of its most popular performers, appearing on the program from 1927 to 1941. He had contracted polio as a 3-year-old, which stunted his growth and left him too frail for farm work, and during his long recovery, he developed a mastery of the harmonica that nobody in Nashville had ever heard before. Roy Acuff later said, "I was an unknown when I began touring with Deford. He could draw a crowd, not me. He helped me get started." Bailey was paid a flat $5 fee per appearance, while his white touring partners earned based on receipts, which meant the man who was drawing the crowds was being paid far less than the people he was drawing them for. Audiences on tours were often surprised to see that Bailey was black. The Opry had not emphasized this on the radio shows. In 1941, Bailey was fired by WSM because of a licensing conflict between BMI and ASCAP, which prevented him from playing his best-known tunes on the radio. Whether the circumstances of that firing were racially influenced has been debated ever since. The accounts of why it happened vary, and historians have reached different conclusions. What is not in dispute is what came next. Bailey opened a shoeshine stand in downtown Nashville and spent the last 30 years of his working life shining shoes, in the same city where the music he had helped build was being celebrated every Saturday night without him. In 2022, the Grand Ole Opry formally apologized to Deford Bailey, acknowledging past injustices and the role it played in suppressing the contributions of its diverse community. His grandson, Carlos Deford Bailey, performed on the same Opry stage that night. Bailey was posthumously inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 2005. Number 7. Clarence Gatemouth Brown, the Bridge Builder, 1940s to 1980s. Clarence Brown was born in Vinton, Louisiana in 1924 and grew up in Orange, Texas, in a household where music was the primary language. His father played country fiddle, blues guitar, and jazz drums, sometimes all in the same evening, and Brown absorbed all of it simultaneously. He took the name Gatemouth from a teacher who said his voice carried through a room like a gate. He became one of the most technically accomplished musicians in American music, equally comfortable on guitar, fiddle, viola, mandolin, harmonica, and drums, moving between country, blues, jazz, and zydeco, not as a novelty, but as a natural expression of what he had grown up hearing. In 1947, he jumped on stage at the Bronze Peacock in Houston when a booked performer collapsed mid-show, played for 45 minutes, and so impressed club owner Don Roby that Roby immediately signed him to his label. Brown's recordings through the 1940s and 1950s were officially categorized as rhythm and blues because that was where the industry put black performers, regardless of what they were actually playing. The country elements in his music, the fiddle runs, the Western swing rhythms, the Texas dance hall sensibility, were not acknowledged in any official category because the country music industry was not prepared to acknowledge a black artist as a country artist. He spent decades building a catalog that crossed every genre boundary the American music industry maintained, and received recognition from all of them eventually. A Grammy Award for Best Traditional Blues Album in 1982, induction into the Blues Hall of Fame, and eventually recognition from the country and roots music communities that had benefited from his influence for decades without fully acknowledging it. He died in September 2005 in Orange, Texas, having been evacuated from his Louisiana home just days earlier because of Hurricane Katrina. He lost everything in that storm: his home, his instruments, his archives. He said he had survived worse. He had. The music industry had spent 40 years putting him in the wrong category, and he had kept playing anyway. Number 6. Ray Charles, the Man Who Changed Everything, 1962. Ray Charles had already won multiple Grammy Awards and sold millions of records as an R&B artist when he walked into a recording studio in 1962 and told his producer he wanted to make a country album. The reaction from the industry was skeptical at best. Country music in 1962 was a white format on white radio with a white audience, and the idea of Ray Charles, a black artist from Georgia whose music had defined the soul and R&B genres, recording country songs was considered at minimum a commercial miscalculation and at maximum a provocation. Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music was released in April 1962 and became the best-selling album of his career at that point. It reached #1 on the Billboard 200, stayed there for 14 weeks, and produced the #1 pop single, I Can't Stop Loving You, which sold over 1.5 million copies in the United States alone. moving more than 100,000 copies per week at its peak. The single simultaneously reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, the Hot R&B Singles Chart, and the Adult Contemporary Chart, setting a 31-year record for the longest simultaneous run at the top of all three charts, a record that stood until Whitney Houston's "I Will Always Love You" in 1993. The album did not just sell, it reframed what country music was and who it belonged to. Charles chose songs by Don Gibson, Eddie Arnold, Ted Daffan, and Hank Williams and recorded them with full orchestral arrangements that made the country melodies sound simultaneously more intimate and more expansive than they had in their original versions. His version of "You Don't Know Me" became the definitive version of a song that country music had considered its own.
This is my last fight.
The album demonstrated beyond any reasonable argument that country music was not a genre bounded by the race of the performer, but a body of American songs that could be interpreted by anyone with sufficient understanding of their emotional content. Country radio's response was largely to ignore it. The album charted on pop and adult contemporary, not country, because the format gatekeepers were not prepared to place a black artist on country stations regardless of what he was recording. Charley Pride would not appear on country radio until 1966. Ray Charles had already proved 4 years earlier that the music itself held no color barrier. The barrier was entirely in the industry. Number 5. Linda Martell, The First, 1969. Linda Martell grew up in Leesville, South Carolina, one of 9 children, and had been performing since childhood in a family group called the Medleys. She had recorded R&B material before her manager steered her toward country music in the late 1960s, a pivot that put her on a path nobody in the format had traveled before. In 1969, she became the first black woman to perform on the Grand Ole Opry stage, walking out in front of the most racially homogeneous audience in American popular music, and delivering a performance that by all accounts was received warmly by the crowd, even as the industry around her remained almost entirely unwilling to support what she was doing. Her debut album Color Me Country was released in 1970 on Plantation Records and produced the single Color Him Father, which reached number 22 on the Billboard Country Chart, the highest chart position a black female country artist would achieve for decades. The album's title was itself a statement, delivered in the year it was delivered, with the deliberate choice of a cover photograph that left no ambiguity about who was making this country record. She had several additional singles that charted modestly through the early 1970s before the format essentially stopped making room for her. In interviews given decades later, she described the experience with a directness that leaves no room for misinterpretation. She said the racism in the country music industry was subtle enough to be deniable and pervasive enough to be inescapable. Booking agents would not return calls. Radio programmers would not add her records. The machinery that supported country careers simply did not operate on her behalf, the way it operated for white artists of comparable or lesser talent. She left the music industry in the mid-1970s and returned to South Carolina. In 2024, she received the Trailblazer Award at the Americana Music Honors and Awards ceremony, 54 years after Color Me Country was released. The first black woman to perform on the Grand Ole Opry stage had to wait 54 years for the industry to formally acknowledge what she had done.
Tonight, looking tired and beat.
4 artists left, and these are the ones whose stories the country music industry spent decades trying to forget. Before we continue, if you have not subscribed yet, do it now and hit the bell. This channel covers classic country history every week, and you will not hear about it any other way. 4 left. Let's finish this. Number 4. O.B. McClinton, The Black Cowboy, 1970s.
I get up in the morning, I think I want.
O.B. Burnett McClinton was born in Senatobia, Mississippi in 1942 and grew up listening to country music on the radio, at a time when the performers he was hearing had no idea a black child in Mississippi was learning every word of every song. He moved to Memphis as a young man and began writing songs, eventually placing material with Otis Redding, James Brown, and other soul and R&B artists before deciding he wanted to record country music himself. The decision was not commercially calculated. It was simply what he wanted to do. He called himself the Black Cowboy, which was both a description and a challenge. A direct statement that the cowboy image country music had built its mythology around was not exclusively white property.
Been gone, my whole world is falling.
He signed with Enterprise Records, a subsidiary of Stax Records, the Memphis soul label, in 1971, and began releasing country singles that received genuine country radio airplay at a time when that was still an extraordinary thing for a black artist to achieve. Between 1972 and 1987, he charted 15 singles on the Billboard Hot Country Songs chart. He appeared regularly on Nashville Now with Ralph Emery, one of the most prominent country music television programs of the era, and built an audience that crossed racial lines in both directions. Black audiences who had grown up with country music, and white country audiences who responded to the music regardless of who was making it.
For another man.
He was diagnosed with cancer in the mid-1980s, and Ralph Emery led public fundraising efforts on his behalf, a measure of the genuine affection the Nashville community had developed for him, even as the broader industry remained structurally resistant to black country artists. He died in September 1987, at the age of 47. His recordings have been reissued and rediscovered by subsequent generations of country and roots music listeners who find in them exactly what he intended: country music made by someone who had loved it his entire life and saw no reason why that love required anyone else's permission. Number 3. Stoney Edwards, Against the Odds, 1970s.
Tell me how she was when you once knew her.
Stoney Edwards was born in Seminole, Oklahoma in 1929, the son of a sharecropper, and spent his early adult years working oil fields and cotton gins while playing music on the side. He had been performing for years without any commercial success when Capitol Records signed him in 1970, the same label that had made Merle Haggard and Buck Owens into stars, now signing a black country artist at a moment when black country artists were still a genuine rarity on major label rosters.
Oh, Hank sure put a whole lot of heart.
His debut single, A $2 Toy, reached the top 20 on the Billboard Country chart in 1971, making him one of the first black artists to achieve that level of commercial success on the country chart. He had a deep, warm baritone voice that sat naturally in the traditional country sound he had grown up hearing, and his recordings for Capitol through the 1970s placed him in the company of the honky-tonk traditionalists he admired. His song Hank and Lefty Raised My Country Soul was a direct statement about his musical heritage. Hank Williams and Lefty Frizzell were the voices that had shaped him, and he was not interested in pretending otherwise or in making music that sounded like anything other than what it was. When he appeared at the Palomino Club in Los Angeles, one of the premier country music venues on the West Coast, Waylon Jennings and Jesse Coulter were in the audience. That detail says everything about where he stood in the estimation of the people who mattered most in country music. He died in April 1997. His recordings have never been as widely acknowledged as they deserve, which is the fate that has followed most black country artists who built their careers in the 1970s. But the doors he helped open, the demonstration that a black artist could chart consistently on the Billboard Country chart and be taken seriously by the format's biggest stars, were real, and the artists who came after him walked through them.
Lefty raised my country soul.
Number 2. Cleve Francis, The Singing Doctor, 1980s to 1990s. Cleve Francis grew up in Jennings, Louisiana, where railroad tracks literally divided the black and white sections of town. His mother saved quarters for nearly a year to buy him a Silvertone guitar from the Sears catalog after he asked for one at age 8, on the condition that he keep his grades up. He kept his grades up. He eventually earned a medical degree from the Medical College of Virginia, moved to Washington, D.C., and built one of the largest cardiology practices in Northern Virginia. He was, according to a Washington Post profile from the mid-1980s, one of only 100 black cardiologists in the United States. He was also, in his spare time, performing country music at local clubs and self-releasing albums on his own label. His break came through a patient. A man named Olaf Hall was recovering at Mount Vernon Hospital when he heard Francis singing in the hallway. Hall's brother was Big John Hall, a member of the R&B group The Heartbeats. Big John arranged an audition. Francis self-financed a music video for a song called Love Light and personally delivered it to country music television. A Capitol Nashville executive saw it, flew Francis to Nashville, walked into the meeting and said, "Who in the hell are you?" "I'm a cardiologist." "Well, that's your problem. I'd like to sign you to Capitol Records." Francis's friend and music producer Moses Dillard told him before he made the decision, "You are the only black person on the face of the earth who has this opportunity. You need to go. You have to hold this spot. You weren't given all these talents for nothing." Tourist in Paradise was released in 1991 when Francis was 48 years old and marked the first prominent recording contract for a black country artist since Charley Pride, a gap of more than 2 decades. He charted 4 singles on the Billboard Country Chart between 1992 and 1994 and appeared on CMT in the same rotation as Alan Jackson, Vince Gill, and Garth Brooks. He returned to medicine in 1994. He later co-founded the Black Country Music Association and worked with the Country Music Foundation to produce a landmark 3-CD box set called From Where I Stand, The Black Experience in Country Music. The singing doctor who self-financed his own music video and hand-delivered it to CMT became one of the most important advocates for black representation in country music history, which is not what anyone expected of the only black cardiologist in the room. Number 1. Charley Pride, the Jackie Robinson of country music, 1960s to 1980s.
So I feel so blue sometimes.
Charley Pride was born in Sledge, Mississippi in 1934, one of 11 children of a sharecropper, and grew up picking cotton and listening to the Grand Ole Opry on the radio. He became a pitcher in the Negro Leagues and then in the minor leagues of Major League Baseball, and it was on a baseball field in Montana in 1962 that he first played guitar for RCA producer Jack Johnson, who heard something extraordinary and connected him with Chet Atkins. Pride signed with RCA Nashville in 1965. The label's first move was to release his initial single, without a photograph, without a press release, and without any public acknowledgement that the artist was black. Country radio began playing The Snakes Crawl at Night before anyone at the stations knew who had recorded it. When Pride began touring as a live performer, the revelation of his race produced reactions that ranged from shock to hostility. Audiences who had been singing along with his records on the radio stood in front of him and did not know how to process what they were seeing. He addressed it directly from the stage, acknowledging what he called his natural tan, telling audiences to judge him by the music, and then delivering performances so commanding that the discomfort in the room gave way to something else. Lefty Frizzell used a racial slur to describe him in his presence. Other artists were less overtly hostile but no more welcoming. He kept going. He played 200 nights a year and turned every room he walked into. 29 number 1 singles. The CMA Entertainer of the Year in 1971, the first black artist to win the award. Induction into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 2000. He outsold Elvis Presley and John Denver in the early 1970s, making him one of the best-selling country artists of the decade by any measure. He was inducted into the Grand Ole Opry in 1993 and remained a member until his death on December 12, 2020. From complications of COVID-19 at the age of 86. He had performed at the CMA Awards on November 11th, exactly 1 month before his death, where he accepted the Willie Nelson Lifetime Achievement Award and sang Kiss an Angel Good Mornin' with Jimmy Allen. It was his final performance. The man who had walked onto stages across the American South in 1966 and told audiences to judge him by his music had spent 54 years proving that the music was more than sufficient. and that the barrier he broke was never as solid as the people who built it believed.